So these ones are calculator questions, because when we combine like terms here, so if I subtract cos x on both sides and add 4 on both sides, I'm going to get negative 2 equals 3 cos x, so dividing by 3 gives me that cos x is negative 2 over 3. Now, to find our reference angle then, we would do cos inverse of positive 2 over 3. So go to our calculator for that. And this question is in radians, so we need to make sure that our calculator is in radians. And we get a reference angle of 0.84. Should probably use approximation symbol there. So now that that's our reference angle, this is negative. Where is cos negative? In quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. So then our angle in quadrant 2 would be pi minus our reference angle. .3. It says to the nearest hundredth. So 2.30, and in quadrant 3, 3.98. How did you do? Good. So this is in quadrant 2. This is in quadrant 3. And this is from 0 to 2 pi. Now we need to check if we change our domain from negative pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. Can you see that that means we're doing quadrant 4 as negative angles and quadrants 1, 2, and 3 as positive angles? And our answers that we did initially we just went from 0 to 2 pi in the positive direction. That's what we do normally. So now when we check our answers, well, quadrant 2 is good, and quadrant 3 is good as well. We didn't have to change anything. Sometimes you're going to have to cross out some answers and add a negative answer instead. But in this case, both of those answers were fine. Yes? So if one had been in quadrant 4, let's say you had our reference angle is 0.84, so if you did 6.28 minus 0.84 and had 5.4642, not that it really matters, you would have got that as your answer in quadrant 4. That answer then you would cancel out and say, well, how would I find that same angle with that same reference angle negative? Then it would just be negative the reference angle in quadrant 4. If you had a different thing, maybe you had you needed a negative angle in quadrant 3, well, you would just do 180 minus your reference angle and make that angle negative. So now we've got our answer in from negative pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2. For the general solution, we're going to write all of our answers from 0 to 2 pi, so that's 2.30 and 3.98, and add 2k pi to each of them. So there's question 1. Pretty straightforward calculator question. Need to find your reference angle, need to find out which quadrants it's in. They did have a change of domain, but it didn't affect us in this question. Part B, same idea, but notice now that we're dealing in degrees. Root 2 cosecant x equals negative 5. Again, we're going to solve it between 0 and 360 degrees first, and then find out that some of our answers may need to be changed. So just like we do with its cosine or tan, the functions that we're used to, we start off by getting our trig function by itself. So I'm going to divide both sides by root 2, so I get cosecant x by itself. Once you get one of your reciprocal functions by itself, if you want to write, instead of cosecant, if you want to write sine, the angle stays the same, the ratio gets flipped. So now we have negative root 2 over 5 equals sine x. Obviously that's not on our pie plate, so we're going to need to find a reference angle again. And a reference angle is always with the positive values. So go to our calculator, change our mode back to degrees because this question's in degrees. And we have 16.4 degrees. Now this question says to the nearest degree, so we could just round that to 16 degrees. Sine is negative in quadrants 3, so we'd get 196 degrees, and in quadrant 4, so we would get 344 degrees. Now, the domain that was given said go from negative 180 to 180. So that means we want to go from 0 to 180 in the negative direction and 0 to 180 in the positive direction. Can you see that our two answers right now are in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4? And in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, we shouldn't have positive ones, because according to the domain, quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 should be negative answers. So as far as figuring out it's x. So for negative 180 less than x less than 180, our answers would be, well, negative 16 degrees. That would be the answer in quadrant 4. And if you wanted to find the one in quadrant 3, again, every time I'm doing negative angles, I think positively, like that's the second quadrant when I'm going in the negative direction, right? So how do we find an angle in a second quadrant? We do 180 minus our reference angle. So I would get 164 degrees, and now because that's a negative angle, I just put a negative in front afterwards. So those are our two answers. And now for our general solution, we could take those two answers that we got from 0 to 360, 196 and 344. And just add 360 degrees times k to write all the coterminal ones with that. Now, when you do exercises in the answer key, you don't have to use these two angles. Sometimes what the answer key will do is if they solve between negative 180 and 180 first and had these two negative answers as their solution, they might write those plus 360 times k. Because negative 16 is coterminal with the 344. So that would be the same answer, just written starting with a different angle. Okay, so the ones that we can do for practice are number 6 and 7.